Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about personality psychology, okay? When we talk about personality, before we really get started, it's important to make a distinction between personality and behavior, okay? Personality is are the underlying motivations, the underlying drives, the underlying forces, for lack of a better term, that push you to act, that influence your behavior. And the behavior or the behaviors are the actions that you take, and they're different. We're going to talk about theories of personality today, and we're going to talk about different ideas behind personality, different understandings of where personality comes from. But one thing to remember is that at least in adulthood, all of the theories say that your personality stays pretty stable. Some of the theories argue that your personality develops through child and adolescence. Some of them say that you're born with your personality and it doesn't really change. But regardless of which theory you subscribe to, and regardless of which one you like the most, when this lecture is done, all of them do say, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, that your personality stays the same once you're an adult, which means that it's stable. That doesn't necessarily mean that your behavior stays the same, and this is an important distinction to make. So, as an example, let's take shyness. Somebody could be shy, and they could demonstrate that shyness in different ways, right? So the shyness stays the same, but the behavior manifests itself differently. Let's take an example of somebody who's 5 years old and who's shy. Well, a 5-year-old child who's brought to a party by, their parent might walk into the party and hide behind their parent's leg. They don't want to face anybody. They don't want to make eye contact. They're shy, and they're going to hide behind their parent's leg. An adult who's shy might go to a party and just stand kind of off to the side and pull their cell phone out a lot and try to keep busy, reading the news feed or, posting or tweeting or whatever in order to avoid eye contact, in order to avoid interacting with other people. The shyness is still the same in the 5-year-old and the adult. The difference between the two is going to be the behaviors that they manifest in order as a function of this shyness, okay? So it's important to make that distinction early on when we're talking about this, because our personalities, again, when we're developing, some theories argue that they evolve or develop, but once we're adults, most theories, if not all of them, say that our personalities are pretty robust. They stay pretty consistent, okay? All right, so personality theories attempt to describe and explain how people are similar and how they're different, and the underlying motivations behind what we do, okay? The first theory that we're going to talk about is Freud's theory of personality. Through Freud's theory, there are consistencies, right? His theory is always going to talk about the unconscious processes that are happening, and his theory is going to talk about what he called developmental stages or psychosexual stages of development, okay? So, according to Freud, the personality develops, and it starts to develop in early childhood through mother-child interactions or parent-child interactions, okay? And the three components of personality, according to Freud, are the id, ego, and superego, okay? We're born with an id and an ego, and the id is basically functioning on the pleasure principle. The id wants what it wants when it wants it immediately. The ego looks at the reality of your circumstances or your situation, and we'll go through a little thought exercise to explain this a little bit more in a few seconds. But the ego looks at your surroundings and your environment, and it tries to look at or identify what the reality is of satisfying the id right now or delaying id gratification, okay? The superego is your conscience. Okay, this is your morality principle. What should you do? And this is imbibed in you by your parents, according to Freud. Okay, so the id you're born with, the ego you're born with, and the superego is your conscience that develops on the morality principle. And these three things are interacting all the time, mostly below your level of consciousness, mostly in your unconscious. Some of this is a conscious process, but most of the time these forces are acting and competing with each other on the unconscious level, okay? So let me give you a little bit of a thought exercise just to go through this quickly. So So you're going to school, and you're a college student, and you go to school every day, and every day you stop at a bodega to get a cinnamon Danish. And every day you hand the person at the cash register $1, and then you take your cinnamon Danish and you walk out. And you do this every day. Now it's graduation week. You're about 1 week before graduation, and you go to this bodega, and there's somebody online in front of you, and they buy the same cinnamon Danish that you normally buy. And they hand the person behind the counter $1, and the person behind the counter hands them $0.25. You look, and you're a little bit confused. And you start to talk to the person behind the counter, and you say, how much is a cinnamon Danish? And without batting an eye, they say 75 cents. And you say, has it always been 75 cents? And they say, yes. And you walk out, and now you start to do math. So the average college student is in college, let's say, for 5 years, okay? And they go to school, let's say, 30 weeks a year. And they go to school 4 days a week. So if you bought a cinnamon Danish every day, 4 days a week, 25 cents a day is $1 a week, 30 weeks a year is $30 a year, times, let's say, 5 years, it's $150. So now you're thinking, there are $150 that I lost by not getting that quarterback every day. So you go back into the bodega the next day, and when you walk in, the cash register drawer is open. There is way more than $150 in that drawer. And the person who works there is in the back stocking the refrigerator. What do you do? Now, immediately thoughts are popping into your head, okay? Some of the thoughts are, let me take all the money. Some of the thoughts might be, let me get the $150 back. Some of the thoughts might be, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Some of the thoughts might be, are there cameras here? Are there cameras watching me? Will I get caught, etc.? Is there anybody else in the store? Each one of these thoughts represents either your id, your ego, or your superego. The thought that says, I'm going to take all the money right now, he owes that to me. That's your id. I want what I want when I want it. The thought process that says, are there cameras around? Will I get caught? That's your ego, examining the situation and trying to see the reality of getting away with it. The thought process says it's wrong to steal. I shouldn't take anything. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Maybe I should have paid attention more. Maybe it's my fault because I never checked the price or I was rushing out. That's your superego, your morality principle. And the 3 of these things are kind of fighting all the time. And in every person, you might favor the id more, you might favor the ego more, you might favor the superego more. But every person's balance of influence within each one of these, or of each one of these, is different. And that difference is partly what makes you who you are, according to Freudian theory. Okay? But this is how this process works. And as we grow and develop, these forces are constantly at work. And some people are more sensitive to their id, some people are more sensitive to the superego, some people are more sensitive to the ego. Okay? All right. Now, another big component in Freud's theory of development is his stage theory. He said we go through 5 developmental stages, what he called psychosexual stages. And in these stages, we go through basically a sort of a conflict, or we go through basically a set of needs, right? And the stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And you can see the ages in the slide here. So in the oral stage, you're talking about babies, newborns. The baby gets pleasure through his or her or their mouth. Okay, so they seek what they call oral gratification. Now, one thing to remember with the stage theory is that according to Freud, the goal is to get satisfied in that stage and then move on to the next stage. If you're satisfied in that stage, you move on to the next. If you're not satisfied, you get stuck in that stage, something that he called fixation. And you're stuck in that stage for the rest of your life, basically. And basically, for the rest of your life, you are seeking gratification of that stage, satiation of that stage. And you're stuck. That's it. And you can see how these behaviors manifest themselves as an adult. Okay? So the stages, the oral stage. Okay? You're seeking gratification through the mouth. This would be through, breastfeeding. This would be through sucking on things, pacifiers, sucking thumbs, etc. And if you're satisfied, if you're provided enough oral stimulation in the oral stage, you'll move on to the anal stage. If you're not given enough stimulus in the oral stage, and you could be overstimulated as well, by the way. But if you're not stimulated enough in the oral stage, you'll spend the rest of your life fixated in the oral stage, seeking oral gratification. So as an adult, you might be somebody who smokes. You might be somebody who bites their nails or chews on pens. I've even seen adults with pacifiers or drinking from baby bottles, right? You might be somebody who talks too much. You might be an alcoholic, right? Freud would argue that all of these things are examples of being fixated in the oral stage. The anal stage is next, in 1 to 3. And in this 1 to 3 stage, it really is about control, okay? So the child is learning and demonstrating a certain level of control. They're learning to control their own body. They're learning to control their own, bowel movements and urinary and urinary functions. And so they're demonstrating their first level of control, okay? And they get satisfied and feel proud if they're able to exert that control, according to Freud. If not, they're stuck trying to seek that control for the rest of their life. They get fixated in the anal stage. And if they get stuck trying to demonstrate that control for the rest of their life, they might try to control their environment in ways that are somewhat extreme. So they might be overly orderly, overly clean, overly neat, right? This is how we control our environment. Things are naturally messy, right? We call this entropy, the natural state, right? It's unnatural to have things all lined up and folded and in order and clean and things like that, right? So people who are overly neat, overly clean, overly orderly, according to Freud, are stuck in the anal stage. And we call those people anal. And that's where it comes from, Freud's theory. If you move on to the anal stage, you end up in the phallic stage. And this is certainly one of the things that makes people uncomfortable when you start talking about Freud, because Freud said that you get pleasure through masturbation. He didn't mean that you get pleasure through masturbation the same way that adults masturbate, to climax or for sexual self-stimulation. Basically what he was saying is that children in this age touch their genitals because it feels pleasurable, and they're exploring their first opposite sex relationship, right? And the first opposite sex relationship that most people have is with their parent. And so the child will touch themselves, touch their genitals, and have basic sexual urges and direct those sexual urges towards the first available object, which typically is the parent. And it's the parent's job, according to Freud, to reject the child. No, Johnny, you can't go to the bathroom with mommy, or, no, Johnny, you can't lift up mommy's skirt, or no, Sally, you can't go to the bathroom with daddy, you're too old for that now, you have to go with mommy, right? And if they receive that rejection, they move on to the latency stage. If they don't receive that rejection, they're stuck in the phallic stage, and Freud argues that they spend the rest of their lives pining to marry their parents. Okay? In the latency stage, the sexual desires become hidden, and kids focus on peers and relationships, and they start to internalize the rules of society, the rules that are imbibed in them by their parents. This is where the superego develops. This is where the morality develops. This is where they start to learn right and wrong. Okay? And theoretically, at a certain point, these sexual urges will reintroduce themselves, and then the child will end up in what Freud calls the genital stage. The adolescent will end up in the genital stage. And in this stage, this is where the child starts to express their sexual desires outwardly and in a healthy way towards appropriate partners. Okay, but again, the potential is that they can become fixated in any one of these stages, and if they do, they'll be stuck in this stage and seeking some type of gratification of that stage for the rest of their lives. Another thing that Freud talked a lot about was something called defense mechanisms. Freud argued that the ego is a very sort of fragile thing, and that the brain is always protecting itself from threats to the ego. And usually the threat comes from anxiety or anything that's unpleasant or uncomfortable. And so the brain basically protects itself from these uncomfortable thoughts, uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable threats. And the way that the brain does this is through defense mechanisms. Okay, and these were some of the more common defense mechanisms that Freud identified: repression, sublimation, denial, rationalization, regression, displacement, projection, and reaction formation. Okay, so repression is basically when you bury a thought or a feeling deep down outside of your conscious awareness. So let's say that you're attracted to, your best friend's significant other. And you might be treating them more nicely, you might be favoring them, thinking about them all the time, and if anybody ever asks you, no, I'm not attracted to them, no, absolutely not. And it's repression if it's outside of your awareness. Denial is similar to repression, but with denial, the individual is aware of their feelings and thoughts. They're just denying them. Sublimation is where you channel these unwanted thoughts or feelings into appropriate ways. So instead of calling up your significant others, your best friend's significant other, and trying to get a date with them and trying to hook up with them, instead of doing that, maybe you sit there and say, you know what, I'm going to take out these energies at the gym, and I'm going to go to the gym every day, and I'm going to try to train for a half marathon. So you're channeling these unwanted thoughts or feelings. The assumption is that you don't want to be attracted to your friend's significant other. So you're channeling these unwanted thoughts or feelings into healthy, more appropriate ways. Okay. Rationalization would be justification. So going with the same example, rationalization, you find yourself attracted to your significant other's, your best friend's significant other, and you sit and say, well, you know what, she's always flirting with me, or he's always flirting with me, or they're always flirting with me, or they're always engaging with me, and my best friend doesn't treat them well anyway, so maybe I shouldn't, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe they'd be better off with me, and it's okay, I can be attracted to anybody I want, right? So you're justifying this behavior. Regression is when you basically act as though you're in an earlier stage of development. You regress. You become more juvenile. So, maybe your best friend's significant other is trying to throw them a surprise party, and they call you up. And you're like, no, I don't want to talk to you. No, I'm busy. No, not answering the phone, right? Which is kind of a very sort of childish way of dealing with this, right? And this could be an example of regression. Displacement is when you displace these unwanted thoughts or feelings onto a safer target. So let's go with a different example for this case. So let's say that your boss yells at you at work, and you can't yell back at your boss, but you're angry. So you could displace this anger onto a safer target, right? Your boss is not safe because if you reflect the anger back, you might get fired. So you displace this anger onto let's say your significant other or your best friend or your child. Okay, so your boss yells at you, you come home, you yell at your kids. Okay, you're displacing these feelings. Projection is when you project unwanted thoughts or feelings onto somebody else. So you could be attracted to your significant other, your best friend's significant other, and then you're like, no, they're attracted to me. That's what it is, right? You're projecting your unwanted feelings onto them. And then reaction formation is when you demonstrate the opposite reaction that you should. So let's say your boss is really, really mean to you all the time and treats you badly and really is nearly abusive to you and your time at the job. And you might sit there and then treat them really, really nicely and say, no, they really care about me, and I'm going to go the extra mile for them all the time, instead of just saying, this is not a job for me, maybe I shouldn't be here anymore, or have a conversation with your boss. Okay, that's reaction formation. Okay, there's a cute video. It's by Key and Peele. It's linked below if the video link still works. And you can show kind of comedic or silly examples of most of the defense mechanisms. And it's not a very long video. It's like 5 minutes, so it might be worth taking a look at. I'm not going to show it right now, but you can take a look at it on your own. There's also sort of a quiz yourself section on the defense mechanisms here, so you can take a look at the defense mechanisms and try to match them up with the scenarios that are listed here. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to move on to humanistic theory. Humanistic theory came as a backlash to Freudian theory and a little bit to behavioral theory. And basically what the humanistic theory posits or ideas or argues is that human psychology, humans are much more complicated than we give them credit for. And it also argues that we need to view humans as inherently good and inherently benevolent individuals. And we need to look at humans as trying to be the best person that they can be. okay? So when you're looking at human behavior, just in general, humanistic psychology argues that people have a choice, which according to Freud, you could argue that so much is happening unconsciously, maybe we don't have a choice. But humanists say people do have a choice. They're good. They're motivated to kind of be the best person that they can be, reach their full potential. And humanistic psychology focuses a lot more on the present and the future, where analytic psychology focused on the past, childhood experiences. Humanistic psychology focused on the future and the present. What's happening today, and how do we deal with what's happening today in terms of the future? How does that help us? How does that make things better? Okay? When practicing humanistic psychology, we need to maintain a level of unconditional positive regard, meaning always finding the good in somebody, always finding something good about them. And so, you have a criminal in your office who's sitting there trying to, break free of their life of crime, even if they've committed horrible crimes in the past, and they're sitting in your office. Well, the humanist will probably view this person as, I'm not going to look at them as a criminal. I'm going to look at them as somebody who's actually trying to get better. And this is good that they're here and they're actually seeking help. Instead of, oh, it's disgusting the things that you've done and it's horrible and you're a terrible burden on society and, why you're here and you belong in prison. No. You're trying to make yourself better. Okay? And self-actualization is basically getting to the point where you realize your full potential and you're starting to give back to the world or to society. Okay? And humanism looked at people's behaviors or personalities as a function of sort of achieving this or working through this hierarchy of needs. And if you look at the hierarchy of needs, it goes from more basic needs to more kind of existential needs, right? So in the beginning is hunger and thirst, right? You have to satisfy your basic biological needs before you could focus on anything else. And I always sort of give the caveman scenario with this. Right? So if you're a cave person living in cave times, right? And, you see the carcass of a dead animal in front of you. Do you go and risk being attacked by another animal to get the carcass? Well, if you haven't eaten in a few days, then you do, right? Hunger, thirst, you have to satisfy that. The next level is safety and security. So you're safe in your cave and you see the carcass and it's surrounded by lions. Do you go after the carcass? You don't go after the carcass if you've eaten recently. If you haven't eaten recently, safety doesn't matter because you need to satisfy the biological needs. The next is love and belonging, right? So you decide that you want a cave partner because you have a nice cave, you have your safety, you have plenty of food to eat, and then you focus on love and belonging, being part of a community, being part of a group, partnering up. And the next thing is esteem, right? Self-esteem, recognition, status, right? So this is where you become king of the cave village because you have all of your other needs met. And then self-actualization is now when you become the benevolent king and you start to give back to society and people, right? Now, not everybody gets through all the levels here, right? Depending on your life, depending on your situation, depending on a number of factors, you might not make it to self-actualization. Maslow and Rogers, the two humanists, argued that everybody would like to get to self-actualization, and that's what they're striving for. But that doesn't mean that everybody does get there, okay? Everybody's kind of working their way up, right? One of the examples I use for this is something like, Bill Gates, and I'm not going to say he's self-actualized per se, but just as an example, when Bill Gates was a kid, right, he always needed the basics, right? He needed food, he needed security, and then he went to college, right? Then he needed to be part of a social group, make friends, and then he kind of went to college. I don't even think he finished college, to be honest with you. But his educational needs were met, and then he needed esteem and recognition, so he made what he thought was the most ubiquitous software program in the world, where he developed Windows, and then made a ton of money on this, and now he just sits there, opening up charities and donating money and research to, end disease and help charitable causes and things like that. So the argument would be that he's probably reached the level of self-actualization. That's arguable, obviously, but for illustration's sake, that's what we're looking at. Okay. A third theory of personality is called trait theory of personality. Trait theory of personality basically looks at or assumes that we're born with a set of traits. Traits are things that are consistent. They're stable characteristics that remain the same in different situations and throughout our entire life. The original trait theorist was somebody named Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport had gone through the Oxford English Dictionary and looked at every word that described, humans. He then put this into 200 clusters, and to break that down and say, these are all the traits that humans have. A gentleman named Eysenck came back and boiled these clusters down into 3 different traits: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. He said everybody has these 3 different traits. Some have more of one or less of another, but we can look at your traits as like a profile. On a scale of 1 to 10, what's your psychoticism? A scale of 1 to 10, what's your extroversion? Scale of 1 to 10, what's your neuroticism? So somebody might be high on psychoticism, a 9, low on extroversion, a 2, and 5 on neuroticism, which might be different from somebody else who's low on psychoticism, a 2, high on extroversion, and low on neuroticism, right? They look like 2 different people. This would explain why they do what they do, because we could sort of see their traits and how their traits influence them. A more recent trait theory is something called the Big Five, or OCEAN. OCEAN is an acronym that starts with that's made up of the first letter of each of the 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, so they took 2 from Eysenck's model, got rid of psychoticism, and added 3 others in. Right? They added openness, conscientiousness, they added extroversion, and they added agreeableness. Okay. They added agreeableness, not extroversion. Extroversion was already there, and neuroticism was already there. So openness is how you like to try new things. Conscientiousness is being motivated to work hard. Extroversion is outgoing. Agreeableness is how well you get along with others, and neuroticism is emotional stability. Okay. Higher on neuroticism, less emotionally stable. Lower on neuroticism, more emotionally stable. So with that, the most amount of research on personality theory is on trait theory. And what we've learned about trait theory is a few things. Number 1, the most predictive trait for job success is conscientiousness. People that load high on conscientiousness tend to do well at work and their jobs. Number 2, these traits tend to be with us from birth. These traits tend to be stable throughout our entire lives and don't really change very much. The one that does change is agreeableness. We tend to get a little bit more agreeable as we get older. But otherwise, they stay pretty stable. People like trait theory for the fact that it's, consistent, it's reliable. The research indicates that it's likely the most accurate. But the reason why people dislike trait theory is because, number 1, traits are so stable that it basically says we don't really have the ability to change them, which makes it hard, as a therapist, to sit there and say, well, you've got this trait for the rest of your life. What am I going to do about it? I mean, you can engage in coping techniques. You can engage in compensatory behaviors to override a trait if it's causing you problems. You can engage in behavior change. But if the trait itself doesn't change, it's a little bit of a daunting proposition to really think about the idea of, change overall. The second thing is we don't know where traits come from. You're just kind of born with them. And if we don't know where they come from, that doesn't mean the theory is bad per se, but it just means that the theory is somewhat limited because it means our understanding of traits is somewhat limited. Are they genetic? Does something happen in the uterus? Are they biologically hardwired? Where do they come from? We don't know. So those are some of the limits of trait theories, but it is one of the more, trait theory itself and personality is one of the more robust, one of the more well-researched theories of personality. Okay, you can kind of go through this, sort of test yourself on the theories. And when you're talking about trait theories, don't worry, it's talking about Eysenck's model, the additional one in Eysenck's model, as well as the Big Five. That's why there are 6 choices here. So using psychoticism as well as the Big Five, OCEAN, you can answer these questions here. Okay, just as a way of testing yourself. And each one is only used once. Okay. Another theory on personality is interpersonal theory of psychology. And basically, interpersonal theory looks at our personality as a function of our interactions with others. It says no human being lives in a vacuum. So we look at our personality as a function of interactions with others. And if that's the case, we always have to identify components of our personality as functions of other people. So self-concept is how you think about yourself, how you evaluate yourself, and self-esteem is how you feel about yourself. Now, this is important in the sense of interpersonal psychology because this really basically explains, or this is really big on, it's always a function of myself in the eyes of other people. How do I think about myself? Do I think about myself as educated? Well, if I'm standing in a room of people that have doctoral degrees or advanced doctoral degrees or, whatever, I might not think of myself as highly educated. If I'm standing in a room of people that, haven't graduated high school, I might think of myself as highly educated, right? How I think about myself as a function of others. It's always influenced by others. It's always relative, according to interpersonal psychologists. Self-esteem is how I feel about myself. So am I proud of what I've done? Do I think it's a good thing or not? Okay, so I have a doctoral degree. Am I proud of this? Well, I could look at myself on one hand saying, yeah, I'm one of the first doctorates in my family, so that's something I'm proud of, and it's something I could feel good about. Or I could sit there and say, well, you know what, maybe my doctoral degree wasn't as competitive as a physics doctorate, which is not actually true. Mine was quite competitive. But maybe it wasn't as competitive as a physics doctorate. And maybe, I just kind of have like this easy doctoral degree to achieve, right? Maybe that's it. So I really shouldn't feel happy or proud of that, right? And that's kind of your self-esteem, okay? You can take a look at the definitions of self-enhance and self-verify. They're just things for kind of your own information, but I'm not sort of requiring that you know this for the course, but you can take a look at it, and if you have questions, feel free to email. I'm going to move on to something called the Johari Window, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment and personality testing. Okay, so the Johari Window is a personality assessment that was built off of interpersonal psychology. And basically what the Johari Window does is it's an exercise to help you and others learn more about your personality. So what you do with this exercise, and you can find one online, and you're welcome to do it on your own. I highly recommend you be careful with this because you can find out things that are disturbing or upsetting. But basically what you do is you download this Johari Window, and they'll give you a 2x2 box, a 2x2 matrix, and then they'll give you a list of like 40 or 50 adjectives at the bottom. And you work on this with somebody that you know. So let's say your name is Adam and you have a friend named Steve, and Adam wants to know more about himself, and Adam wants Steve to know more about Adam. So Adam is going to take his list of adjectives, and give a copy of the same list as Steve. They both have the same list. Adam's going to go through and circle everything that Adam believes applies to Adam. Steve is going to go through the same list without looking at what Adam circled. And Steve is going to circle everything that he thinks applies to Adam. Adam's then going to take this list and compare it. Everything that they both circled in common goes to what's called the known self. These are the things that I know about myself, and these are the things that I project in the world and I let other people see about me. Okay? The hidden self are the things that Adam circled about himself that Steve didn't circle. These are the things that I know about myself, but I keep secret. For one reason or another, either on purpose or by accident, but I don't share these things with the world. Don't worry about the unconscious self at all. That's all about, analytic therapy and deep introspection, etc. So we won't get to that, and it's not worth knowing for the case of this. But the third one is something called the blind self. The blind self are all of the things that Steve circles about Adam that Adam did not circle about himself. And these are the things that Steve sees in Adam. Why is this important? It's important because we never know how we come across to other people. And we are not as insightful as we would like to think that we are. So having somebody circle these things about us can be very, very insight building. It can be very, very informative about us. Because maybe Adam is a boss, and maybe Adam thinks he's a very benevolent boss, and he thinks he takes time for everybody. But Adam is also very conscientious, and he works hard, constantly taking on projects and things like that. And Steve might not get as much time as he wants to with Adam. So Steve might write something like aloof, And Adam's going to write something like conscientious. And they talk to each other now. And this is going to fall into, aloof is going to fall into the blind self from Adam. And what are you talking about? Why do you put aloof? And, Steve is going to say, well, every time I try to talk to you, you never have time for me. You're distracted. You're not paying attention. You're thinking about other things. And it's interesting because maybe Adam can be aloof, but he didn't realize that about himself. And so this can be used in a business setting, this can be used in a relationship setting, but it's important to understand that the interpersonal psychology basically assumes or posits that you won't ever fully know yourself unless you look at yourself through other people's eyes, and this is sort of one way to do it. Okay? All right. Next, personality tests. Okay? So I'm going to talk about personality tests in the context of psychometric testing, and I'm going to talk about personality tests specific to personality testing as a whole. Okay, so when you're talking about personality tests, these are assessments that have been developed and normed on the population. So they always have to be taken. You always have to give a personality test that's been built off of the population of which the person you're testing. So if I built this test and I practiced this test and I developed this test on people in northeastern United States, and that's all I tested, well, that's all this test would be good to measure. Right? And when we talk about testing, we talk about two different concepts, reliability and validity. Reliability means consistently. It's not good or bad. It just means that you're getting similar results again and again. And if I'm giving you a personality test, and your personality doesn't change over time, if I give you this test at two different times, you should get similar results. That's reliability. If your personality changes every time we give you this test, well, there are two things to think about. Number one, either our theories of personality don't make sense, which at this point they've been researched enough where they probably do, or it's not a reliable test. And if the test is not a reliable test, it's probably not a very good or useful test, because we want to make sure that it's consistent. Compare this to a blood test. Let's say I give you, I give you a test for cholesterol. And I do a blood draw and I see that your cholesterol is 205. And then 5 minutes later, I give you a blood draw and it says your cholesterol is 50. It's not a reliable test. We know that your cholesterol doesn't go up and down that fast. And we know that if we're testing your cholesterol, the numbers need to be accurate. If your numbers don't go up and down that fast, but I'm getting these two very different readings, I have to start to question the test that I give. And since we know personality is consistent, if I give you this personality test and it's not giving me consistent results, then I know it's probably not a reliable test. I know it's definitely not a reliable test, and it's probably not a very good or useful test. Okay? Now, validity is another thing that's important. In general, validity means accuracy, right? So a valid test is a test that measures what it's supposed to measure. Okay, in the abstract. I don't want to get too much into test construction or research methods or things like that right now because it's a complicated concept, but just know that validity basically means accuracy. Is this thing accurately measuring the thing that it's supposed to be measuring? Okay? Now, again, without getting into the whole thing, something that's worth knowing is if a test is reliable, if a test is not reliable, it cannot be a valid test. Okay? Going back to the personality example, if we know personality is stable and we test your personality with this test and we give you the same test twice and I get very, very different results, it's not a reliable test. If it's not reliably testing for personality, it can't possibly be testing for personality because personality is stable. It can't work that way. Okay? Now, there are tests that can be reliable but not necessarily valid. Okay, and I'll give you a very weird and obscure example. But let's say I put you on a scale for your weight. And you get on the scale and you weigh 100 pounds. You get off the scale, you get back on, you weigh 100 pounds. You get off the scale, you get back on, you weigh 100 pounds. That's a reliable scale. And let's say I'm some really kooky psychologist and I sit there and I say, I'm going to test your personality. Get on this scale. You weigh 100 pounds. Okay, your personality is of the person that's 100 pounds. You come off, you get back on again, come off, get back on. It's 100 every time. Well, guess what? It's a reliable scale. Is it a valid scale? Is it really measuring personality? No. So in that case, it's reliable but not valid. I know this is a silly example, but it's an extreme example to just sort of demonstrate the point. So tests can be reliable but not necessarily valid. What we need with personality tests is ideally for them to be both reliable and valid. And we need predictive validity with personality tests. Meaning that let's say I'm doing an assessment or a test of psychological disorders. I just need to know what your symptoms are right now. Do you meet criteria for depression? Do you meet criteria for an anxiety disorder? Do you meet criteria for psychosis? If you have enough symptoms today, you meet criteria. That's all I need. I don't need to know what's going to happen in your future, right? In order for you to test positive for this. Predictive validity means, does it predict something in the future? And if a personality test is designed to measure your personality, and your personality is expected to influence your behavior for the long term, then a personality test should have some predictive validity. It should be able to predict outcomes. One of the things that we talked about is the biggest predictor of workplace success are high levels of conscientiousness. Okay? If I give you a personality test that's measuring for conscientiousness, and you take that today, and you're loading high on conscientiousness, well, you better do well at your job, right? And if you do well at your job, and that correlates, meaning is associated with, correlates, has a relationship with conscientiousness, well, then this test has a high level of predictive validity, which is what we're looking for in personality tests. Okay, it needs to predict something in the future, and it needs to predict kind of what we want it to predict. Okay? There are a number of different personality tests. The two different types of personality tests in general are what we call objective tests and projective tests. Objective tests are tests that are theoretically based in objective or observable or verifiable measures or verifiable behaviors or verifiable indicators, right? It's objective, it's verifiable, it's you can see it, you can measure it, all that kind of stuff. A projective test is different. Projective tests are based in unconscious process. They really come from Freud, and they're really a function of looking at how the individual projects their unconscious processes outward. Okay, we'll get to that in a few seconds. Let me finish objective tests. An objective test is a psychological test in which an individual answers standardized questions about their behavior and feelings. We then compare this to established answers about behaviors and feelings. They can demonstrate differences between people and can sometimes demonstrate either personality or psychological disorders. One of the most common objective tests is something called the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, 2nd edition. The MMPI is used frequently in law enforcement, fire department, I believe it's used in the military, and basically what the MMPI-2 does is it's based on a series of scales. Okay, there are different scales in the MMPI-2 without going into them, but these scales are supposed to be components of our personality. And the scales are a little bit antiquated with their names. One of them is masculinity, femininity. One of them is psychopathic deviant, right? These things do need to be updated. But what we found is that people that answer in certain ways across these questions tend to show particular tendencies going forward. This is the predictive validity part. And so based on previous results of previous people who've taken this test, we're going to compare your results to them and get a relative result on your level of masculinity, femininity, psychopathic deviant, etc. And we're going to get your relative rating. And so based on the population, based on everybody who took this test, are you in the top percentage? Are you average? Are you in the low percentage? And we've used this test to see how people fare in, certain situations, particularly law enforcement. So people that test high or low on certain scales in this test tended to do either better or worse in law enforcement, depending, or better or worse in other areas professionally, depending. And so what will happen is that we'll use this test to weed people out for the job. So let's say people that tested very high on the psychopathic deviant scale, and this is just an example, tended to have more complaints lodged against them. So police officers or people that took the test that became police officers that tested high in the psychopathic deviant scale tended to have a lot of, complaints. Complaints about, possible violence on the job, complaints about, assaults, things like that, inappropriate conduct, whatever we're talking about, right? So people had those complaints lodged against them that tested high in psychopathic deviant in the past. Well, now what we're going to do is every person we give this test to, if they're loading high in the factor or the trait of psychopathic deviance as measured by the MMPI-2, we're going to sit there and say this is not a good fit. This is not a good person for this job. I don't know if they'll necessarily have the same problems as somebody else, but what I know is people that measured this way in the past had problems. You're measuring this way, it's not worth taking the chance. Okay, if that makes sense. The MMPI-2 is a weird test. It's 456 multiple, I know it says over 500 here, it's actually 456 multiple choice questions, and it's true and false questions. And what this does is having this large number of questions creates reliability. Because if you answer a similar question 27 times, that's going to give us a more consistent response pattern from you. And I'll give you a silly example of reliability, right? So let's say you're a student in biology, and I want a reliable measure of your knowledge of biology. If I ask you one bio question, there's a 50% chance you're going to get that right. Right? If you get it right, do I know that you're good at biology? You might be, you might not be, but I don't know for sure. If I ask you 10 questions in biology and you get them all right, do I know that you're good at biology? Maybe, probably, but not for sure. If I ask you 1,000 questions in biology and you get all 1,000 questions right, do I know that you're good at biology? Probably. And that 1,000 question measure is a more reliable measure because I'm getting a more consistent result. Okay? The more questions you ask, the more consistent the results are. Okay? And the more consistent the results, the more reliable they are. Now, that doesn't have to do with validity. We talked about validity before. Look, I could be giving you math questions and saying that that's a measure of your biology ability. And I can say anybody who's good at math is probably good at bio. That's not a valid measure of your biology knowledge. It could be a reliable measure because I could give you 1,000 math questions and you could get all 1,000 right. And I could know reliably you're performing high on these tests. But it might not be a valid measure because it might not be accurately measuring your ability to do well in biology. Okay? All right. Now, the MMPI is considered a self-report because you're talking about a feature or ideas or concepts or traits or things in you. And there are other self-report measures. The MMPI is just one of the more common ones. Self-report measures tend to have some strengths and they tend to have some weaknesses. The strengths of self-report measures are that everybody's getting the same stimulus, everybody's getting the same question, so it standardizes everything. Once you start to give inconsistent questions, the answers become inconsistent, and the measure becomes more difficult to be to get clear results on. So they're standardized. We base it on population norms. We've tested other people tens of thousands of times in the past. We know how the population is going to answer, and I don't want to get into all bell curves and everything like that and normal distributions, but basically we know how people are likely to answer. Some people are going to answer in the extreme, but most people are going to answer sort of in the middle. And so we can compare you based on how you're answering these questions to the population and know where you fit. Okay, the tests tend to be consistent, they're reliable, and they tend to predict behavior. So these tests tend to be good at giving us an indication of what may or may not happen. So people that score very high in certain areas of the MMPI, consistently in the past tend to have performed poorly as an officer of the law, and so it's been a valid measure. If this test is designed to predict that, then it's been a valid measure. And again, there's no telling why. Right? We don't know why, somebody ends up doing what they're doing, but we know that, it's been predictive. It's been able to tell us what happens in the future. Okay. Weaknesses of self-report. People can fake responses. You don't have to tell the truth. Now, on a test that has so many questions like the MMPI-2, and not all of them have this many questions, but in a test with so many questions, it tends to be harder to fake responses. And we also have sort of certain what we call lie scales built in, which means that we can tell if you're faking responses. We don't know why you're faking responses. We don't know what you're lying about, but we can tell if you're following patterns similar to other people who fake responses. Because in testing this, we've said, we've brought in people and said fake, look this way or look that way or fake your responses, as we're developing the test. And guess what? Other people, when they take it, other people's responses tend to match other people who fake them. So we say likely that you're faking the response. Okay, and we know that based on the test. So it's hard to fake these things, especially a long test, but you can. You can, and you can try to look more socially desirable. All right. Long tests, people can just kind of bottom out at the end. They just kind of give up. They lose all drive and motivation. So it's very hard for them to kind of really pay attention. So the last, 100 questions or 50 questions, people might just be answering anything. And so it might be hard to get sort of a reliable result because people just give up. I mean, think about it now. Online, somebody gives you a 5-question survey, and by question 3, you're like, I'm done. An answer, whatever. Every, 10, 10, 10, or 1, 1, 1, or 5, 5, I don't care. Just end the damn survey, right? So, reliable, so people might kind of peter out at the end of these. Okay. The other thing is that people might not be insightful. We talked about this before. People might not be good judges of their own thoughts or feelings or behaviors. And if you're not a good judge of your thought, feeling, or behavior, you might not accurately report this stuff. You might think that you're somebody that you're actually not, right? We talked about this in the Johari window, right? You might think that you're being very benevolent, and somebody else might think that you're being aloof. So even though you think you're one way, you might not be who you think you are. I'm not talking about multiple personalities or dissociative identity disorder. I'm not talking about, anything like that. I'm just saying you might value yourself or look at yourself in one way, and other people might see you very, very differently. And so if the general consensus of the population is to see you one way, but everybody else sees you differently, you have to start to think really a lot about how you're evaluating yourself, and are you evaluating yourself accurately or not. Okay, so we're going to move on to projective tests. Okay, I mentioned before that a projective test is a test that is rooted in psychoanalytic theory, and analytic theory basically talks about your unconscious. A projective test, or projective tests in general, are designed to give you ambiguous stimuli and encourage you to respond to the stimulus or stimuli. And when you respond to the stimulus or stimuli, the thought is that if it's ambiguous enough and we allow you to respond freely, what will happen is that you will start to disengage your defense mechanisms, and unconscious thoughts or feelings are going to start to come out. Okay? I don't want to go into all of the details of projective testing and things like that and how they're scored, because the scoring can be extremely complicated, and it can also be a little bit arbitrary. People can kind of interpret these things sort of any way they want. Hopefully there's a lot of training involved. I did have a lot of training in scoring and interpreting projective tests. And that's supposed to create a certain level of reliability, but it doesn't always. People can still look at these things in very subjective ways, and because it's not, because the interpretations aren't formalized per se. There's, with the Rorschach test, which we'll talk about first, there is a scoring system in place, but with a lot of these other projective tests, there's no scoring system in place. Without consistent scoring, it's hard to, interpret reliably. Once you have poor reliability, validity is kind of all over the place. There are benefits to projective tests, though. Okay, so the big projectives that we'll talk about now are the Rorschach, TAT, or thematic apperception test, and then sentence completion test. Okay. All right. So this is an example of an altered version of one of the Rorschach cards. And the Rorschach cards are just a series of ink blots on paper, on these basically cardboard pieces, that you show the individual. There are 10 of them. This is an example that looks similar to one. It's not exactly one, but it's an example that looks similar to one. And you'll show this to the person, and you'll basically kind of ask them what they see. And then they'll tell you what they see. And then you'll kind of ask them, what makes it look like that? And it's a very, you'll write down all of their answers and then analyze every word they say and how they answer it later on, not in front of them, obviously. And then there's a whole scoring system that goes along with it. And within the scoring system, as you're scoring this, there are different scales, right? There is a depression inventory, there is a suicide inventory, there's a psychotic inventory, there are a few different inventories based on, certain personality features or components. And then you can write an interpretive report based on this. One thing to remember about psychological testing in general, and specifically for projective tests and personality tests, but in general, you never give one test. Because the results from one test are never going to be reliable. Even if the test itself is reliable, you always give more tests. Because you want between test reliability. You want two different tests to say the same thing. So if I give the Rorschach and you're loading very high on depression, I'm going to want to give you another test, just to make sure. And if the other test says, yes, depression, the same way Rorschach did, well, then I know something, it's probably indicating something accurately. But if I get two different tests and they say two widely disparate things, one says depression and the other one says mania, well, either you're rapid cycling bipolar or schizoaffective disorder, and you went through a cycle between the time I gave you the two tests, or there's something wrong with the results on the tests. Okay? So it's just something to be mindful of. Another type of projective test is the TAT, thematic apperception test, and there are different versions of the TAT. This is an example of one card from one version of the TAT. And basically what I would do is I would give this to a client, and I would say, tell me a story about what's happening in this picture. Tell me what happened right before, tell me what's happening in the picture, and tell me what happens after. And I would be looking for themes. Okay? This is vague, right? If you look at this carefully, it's hard to tell a lot of things. What's the relationship between the two people? Are they related? Are they friends? What are the intentions of the person with their hand in the air? What's going on with the person laying down with their eyes closed? Is that a male or a female or other? Are they awake? Have they passed away? And people can interpret this anyway, right? And people have kind of strong reactions to it, but they can interpret it anyway. And the thought is that, again, once I've given you enough of these cards that are ambiguous, and they all look very different. The style's the same, the black and white is the same, with the sort of pencil shading drawing is the same, but the themes and the cards are different. But if I'm getting similar thematic responses from you, I can identify these themes and interpret these themes to mean certain things. I'll give you an example. I was giving somebody this test, and every story, at the end of their story, tell me what happens afterwards, ended up in people dying and people killing each other. Every story, no matter what. And if you met this person in person, there was no violence, that you could see in this person. There was nothing that indicated that there was any violence or anything like that. But these themes kept coming out again and again. And then these themes actually kept coming out with their answers in the Rorschach too. And so once you start to get that sort of consistent style of response, if you believe in and support projective testing, you can interpret those responses as meaning something, right? Person definitely, voiced aggressive themes, violent themes consistently again and again. This is congruent with their past, and blah, 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 whatever it is. Okay, so they can be kind of useful that way. This is an example of the sentence completion test. This is one that seems to be used in a correctional population. There's certainly others, because this one asks a lot about jail and prison and things like that. But you can look at some of the more vague questions and some of the more universal questions. So take a look at number 10, my mind. So you present this with somebody and you say, this is going to start a sentence for you. I want you to complete the sentence. And you don't give them any other prompt than that. And so they'll look at this and say, my mind. And now, because it's so broad and open, whatever they write is a very subjective thing. And based on principles of that Freud called free association, where you basically let somebody just talk uninterrupted, and eventually their unconscious influences will come out, this kind of does the same thing. So somebody might say, my mind wanders. My mind races all the time. My mind is useless. Right? And if you look at all of these answers, they all mean something different. And again, one answer of saying something like, my mind is useless, is not very telling of anything. But if there are 10 answers, my childhood was awful, skip to number 3, I think as little as possible. Skip to number 6. Most of the time, I really am just miserable. Okay, now go back to my mind is just useless. Now do you start to see themes in the person's answers? And when you start to see those themes in those answers, and then you compare that with the TAT, where they might be saying things like, oh, this old person is the child's father, and the young person is the child. I'm not saying that that's the relationship, but this is how the person's interpreting it. And the father is just so upset and drawn out about the fact that the son fails at everything in their lives, and they can't do anything right. And he's, thinking about even hurting the son, but he can't bring himself to because it's still his son, but he's just so exasperated by his son's failures. Okay, well, guess what? Now you have a lot more themes. Okay, and consistent themes. And that's what somebody might do when they're interpreting the TAT, okay, and the Rorschach and the sentence completion test, etc. Okay, all right. Benefits and drawbacks of projective tests. Theoretically, they can access the unconscious process. They can allow for an infinite number of responses, right? A true-false test or a multiple-choice test limits the number of responses that you can have. But something as open-ended as this, anybody could write anything or say anything when they're given an ink blot, or say anything when they're given one of the TAT cards, which means that we could get at stuff that we didn't even realize was there, which is always interesting and can be beneficial. They can break down defense mechanisms. If somebody's putting their guard up, it's hard for them to keep their guard up throughout an entire test battery, meaning a number of different tests, right? It's hard for them to kind of keep that up. You might be able to present as controlled and organized with 1 or 2 questions or 1 or 2 cards, but eventually, if the person is disorganized or psychotic or something else is going on, you start to see this stuff come out. It's hard for them to contain this over an entire series of tests. It really is. And it can be more engaging, right? Giving them the freedom to just talk and to kind of discuss anything they like can be more engaging to the client in ways that a true-false test or, a multiple-choice test might not. The bad things, that we talked about before, right? It's subject to the interpretation of the person giving the test. The assessor's person giving the test is subject to interpretation, right? So I might interpret their answers differently. I might interpret that TAT response of, the father, being disappointed in the son, and the patient maybe identifying as the son, and, with the themes of the other answers that they gave in the sentence completion. Or somebody else might interpret it differently. Somebody else might interpret themselves as the father, frustrated and angry and disappointed and let down by, what the son did or didn't do, right? And if you interpret that differently, it leads to different results and different conclusions. So, it's subjective. It's subject to the interpretation. It's not that I'm scoring it and then just reading the results and basing the results on a scale. Okay? Mixed reliability, right? It's not as reliable, or these are not as reliable as other tests. Although some people who really, really love these tests or really support these tests do argue that the reliability rates are relatively high if the training is correct. Again, I don't have the data on that, so I'm not going to speak to it one way or another, but I do know that the reliability tests tend to be lower on the projective tests. I don't know how much lower, but they tend to be lower. They're difficult to score, right? You can't really assign numbers to, sentence completion. You can't really assign numbers to a TAT response. A gentleman named Exner did try to assign numbers to the Rorschach test, but the scoring system for the Rorschach is so overly complicated. I trained on it just to give you an example of how overly complicated it is, I trained on it for 2 years. And by the end of the second year, actually no, I trained on it for 5 years. By the end of year 5, I felt comfortable giving it and scoring it, and then I didn't do it for a year, and I've forgotten so much of it right now because it's so complicated that I would not feel competent giving it again right now. I just wouldn't. The scoring is so complicated that I felt like if I tried to score it now, I would do such a bad job that the results that I would get would be inaccurate. So scoring these things is difficult. And then the predictive validity part is also debatable. How much do they predict things accurately is debatable. Some people say that they're accurate predictors. Some people say that they're not. One of the things that you have to remember is that because I'm not giving them a scale with cutoffs like I do with the MMPI. The MMPI I'm going to, score hypothetically in a scale of, plus 10 to negative 10. And, 0 being average, right? Let's say, I'm making this up, but just to give you an example, right? And people that load plus 10, the cutoff is, 7 to join the police department. If you're 7 or above, again, I'm making all this up. If you're 7 or above, you can't join the police department. So simple. And I predict that 7s, people who are 7 or above don't do well. And so I don't hire the 7s. And in the past, 7s have done well, and we're done. That's, kind of predictive, it's easy to create a level of predictive validity. With something like the Rorschach or the TAT or the sentence completion test, and there are others, you're going to write a report. And you want to be as specific as possible, but you also want to be somewhat vague. You want to be specific because you want to be clear and you want the report to mean something. But you also want to be vague because you don't want to say something so specific that A, it's inaccurate because it's so specific, or B, it opens you up to a level of liability. So without going into too much detail, if you've ever read a Rorschach report, because all of these tests are followed up by a written report and interpretation of results. If you've ever read one of these reports, they're a little bit on the vague side. And for some psychologists, they're too vague to be useful. So they might say something like, you tend to get overwhelmed frequently, and you tend to find yourself, having difficult time in interpersonal relationships. This could be 100% accurate, but it's also so vague that it could be 100% accurate for almost anybody that I give it to if they interpret it a certain way, right? So again, it's something that's debatable with regard to the level of predictive validity. Okay, debatable. Not useless by any stretch of the imagination, and some people live by these projective tests, make their entire career of these projective tests, and they can be very helpful, very effective if used correctly. But other people, have strayed away from this. And in contemporary psychology, these projective tests are starting to lose a little bit of traction in favor of the objective tests for a number of different reasons. Some of which are ease of use, some of which are speed of administration, some of which are based on insurance reimbursements, some of which are based on standardizations, in certain areas, etc. So there's a lot, there are a lot of things that, go into how these things evolve and what we use them for later on. But just know that they exist, they're still being used, but fewer places are tending to use them nowadays. Okay? All right, so that's it on the theories of personality. Again, this is for an intro course, so it really is basic and general. I didn't go too deep into anything. There are courses on personality psychology that go much, much more in depth on all of the theories. I'm assuming they go more in depth on personality assessments and things like that. But this is just a general overview. So take a look at the video. Feel free to pause it, rewind it, take notes, etc. But that's about that. I hope you enjoyed it.